Welcome to this new episode of the Blue Dragon podcast. And in this 8th episode of season 2, I'm interviewing Purav Desai. He is a dual Microsoft MVP, and we talked a lot about Microsoft Purview and the importance of compliance and the regulation space in Europe. So enjoy this episode. So welcome everybody at this new episode of the Blue Dragon podcast. And today I'm joined by someone who's quickly becoming a leading voice in the Microsoft security space. Purav Desai, he is a dual Microsoft MVP. He's recognized across both SIEM and XDR and Microsoft Purview compliance, which is actually a very nice combination. He's currently a Microsoft 365 and Azure incident responder for a financial services firm in London. And he's actually working there at the sharp edge of cyber defense in the financial sector. He has over 12,000 followers on LinkedIn. He is a respected educator. He has a very interesting GitHub series called Deciphering UAL. And his LinkedIn posts have helped thousands of professionals get more value and understanding of Microsoft Purview, Defender XDR, and the wider M365 stack. So Purav, thank you so much for joining. Welcome.
Thank you for the lovely intro, Jetro. And yeah, nice to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Great, it's great to have you on. Now let's start with the eye catcher. It's something rare that you see, a dual Microsoft MVP. So what does that mean exactly, and how did you end up earning that double recognition?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I became MVP for the first time last year in the award category of security and the technical area of SIEM and XDR, like you said. Now, previously, the technical area of Purview was actually specific to Purview information protection, which meant that the content that I was doing around Purview audit and Purview eDiscovery didn't necessarily fit. So I couldn't supply those contributions even though I did them. But then later last year, I think Microsoft changed it from Purview information protection to all of Purview, because they clearly recognize that there's more to Purview than just information protection, right? Purview is a whole stack of various solutions. So when it came to my renewal, I was able to submit the contributions that I had done for audit and eDiscovery in the technical area of Purview. And yeah, I mean, that got recognized. So my contributions were kind of a mixture of SIEM and XDR as well as Purview, audit and eDiscovery. And because they fit now into two technical areas, that's how I submitted the application. I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to work, like how many you need to do and things like that to get that dual category. But I'm glad they appreciated what I've done. And yeah, for the first time, I've become a dual security MVP, which is really cool. There's a few people I know that also have similar dual in other technical areas. But I think, like you said, SIEM and XDR and Purview is quite a unique combination. And I'm not sure how many other dual MVPs have that combination. So I'm proud, I'm grateful, and I appreciate the community for all the constant support, because that helps me get such opportunities and yeah, ultimately unlocks things like MVP dual status, which I now have.
Great. So congratulations with that. That's a wonderful achievement. Now, what I always like to know from my guests, especially if they are a Microsoft MVP, is at what moment during your career did you make the decision, I really want to become an active voice in the Microsoft community, and especially in your case, the security space?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I've always done a level of content creation from back in 2012. I had a YouTube channel where I used to do tech videos. It wasn't Microsoft focused, it wasn't cyber focused, it was just reviewing phones and things like that, right? But 2019 is when I started to switch my career wise, moving into cyber. And I started doing, blog posts here and there about phishing emails and things. And back then I probably had only 6 followers, right? Very small audience. And I kept at it, right? So 2022, I think I did a webinar for the company that I was working at the time. And that helped, get some good reach. But it wasn't really until 2023 where I really dove deep into Microsoft security, specifically the forensics element. And I discovered a niche, right, which is the deciphering UAL that you touched on. And I think finding that niche really made me think wow, this is content worthy potentially of MVP. That wasn't necessarily the goal, because I think if you have that as a goal and then you don't make it, you get quite disappointed. So my kind of ambition was, I'm going to focus on this niche. No one else is covering it in the community. Microsoft documentation isn't even touching this this at all. So if this is adding value to my organization, there must be other organizations and also people in the community that could benefit from this, right? And at high level, deciphering UAL basically helps you to make sense of all the different GUIDs and IDs that Microsoft have in various operations in M365. So once I started figuring out that for myself, I thought, this is content I can contribute back to the community. And that's when I started my GitHub. I started doing more talks. I got a few book opportunities. And then all of that really made me think like, wow, this is actually worthy of MVP. And then when I got nominated for the first time by a fellow MVP in the community, I brushed up my application and yeah, eventually I made it to where I am now. But I think, if someone listening is aspiring on that journey, just start making content. But the key thing I would say is you need a niche because there's loads of MVPs out there. So what's going to differentiate you from everyone else? And once you find that niche, and obviously there are many niches there that are untapped and undiscovered, once you find that niche, go really deep and start making content. And then you also similarly can follow a path like mine.
That's wonderful advice. That's great. Thanks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, like many of our listeners, they are CISOs or they are IT and business leaders or heads of IT across Europe. How would you describe what you actually do today as an M365/Azure like incident responder? How would you explain that to them?
Well, that's a good question. Okay, so I'm basically helping the organization from having cyber attacks, right? So ultimately, incident response is quite reactive. So something's already happened. So it's kind of a mixture. So let me go back to your question. So I would say to those IT leaders, I'm kind of performing a dual function, right? So one is that if an incident happens, I'm helping the organization to handle it, specifically gathering forensic artifacts to prove or disprove the claims as part of the incident, right? Like if we have an incident about a user doing something suspicious in SharePoint, uploading a file, my role mainly would be to gather those artifacts to prove or disprove that claim. But then additionally, I'm providing ideas for maturity in terms of capability building around automation, around graph to prevent such incidents occurring in the future. Or if we can't prevent them, helping the organization quickly remediate them through things like automation and AI as well. So at high level, that's how I describe what I do to those business leaders.
That's nice. That's great. Because me as a CISO, I write the policies on how to handle an incident, like from a policy perspective. I have a right hand, let's say, team that then looks into how can we automate this and detect it as well as we can and respond to it. So that's basically where you come in with all your knowledge and automations.
Yes, correct. So the main thing is, handling the incident while it's there. So you need to gather those artifacts, you need to take any containment actions, remediation, etc. But it's always worth thinking about, well, if this was to occur again, how can I deal with it better next time? Can I prevent it? Because that's ideally the goal. And if I can't prevent it, how can I make it more efficient so that me and my team can, deal with those incidents and close them out quickly? So yeah, that would add a lot of value to a CISO, right? The policies and things they put in place are great, but how can you optimize those for the day-to-day workflows? And more importantly, how can you make it more efficient for future incidents?
Exactly. Great stuff there. Now let's talk a bit about the Microsoft Purview compliance and governance because wherever I turn, independent of the tooling and technology, governance, risk, compliance in terms of cyber is now high on the agenda of many organizations, especially with NIS2 or NIS2 in Europe. So you're well known for your work with Purview Audit and eDiscovery. So let's say for IT business leaders that are trying to grasp what it's all about, like what's the strategic value of Purview, how would you explain it?
So specifically for Purview Audit, right, it basically will show you all the activities that's occurring in your Microsoft 365 tenant. So as a business leader, you'll have many employees in your company. You need to be able to understand what they're doing in Microsoft 365 because they could be opening you up to data risks that you're not aware of. For example, if they share a file outside the organization through SharePoint, right, with a threat well, unintentionally with a threat actor or potentially even a colleague or even a partner from an external organization, you may not want that to happen. But unless you can, audit your environment using Purview Audit to identify cases of where such activities are occurring, you won't be able to defend against it. You need to kind of take inventory of what's happening in your organization now to then better train your users, but also then to put preventions in place or optimizations in place to deal with it in future. So in brief, Purview Audit really helps you to understand all the activities that's happening in your Microsoft 365 tenant. And for those unfamiliar, the key workloads in Microsoft 365 would be things like SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and Exchange Online. There are obviously other workloads, but those are the main ones that organizations care about. And Purview Audit will show you all the activities happening in those workloads. Now, Purview eDiscovery is a bit different. So Purview eDiscovery allows you to retrieve the content from those various workloads. So if someone puts a file in SharePoint that's a malicious file, or it's a file that contains passwords and starts sharing it around the organization, you from an incident response perspective or from a compliance perspective, you need to be able to retrieve that Excel file or email or SharePoint file or even a Teams chat to understand exactly what's happened, right? To gather that context to then take the necessary action. So thinking about that SharePoint example we gave earlier about sharing it outside the organization, if you can recover that spreadsheet and you see that there's passwords in it, you can take some immediate containment actions because maybe those passwords are still in use. So you now know that those passwords are potentially exposed. So you need to quickly be able to reset those passwords, right? Another example could be a secret access key to an Azure storage account. Similarly, you'd want to reset those to prevent any sort of action taking place. So eDiscovery will help you retrieve the content from M365, whereas Purview Audit will show you the activities that happen in M365. They complement each other very well, and in fact, you can even audit the eDiscovery usage because from a CISO, you're thinking, well, okay, surely if anyone pulls any data from M365, what if they pull my emails? My emails are sensitive, right? I'm talking to the board. I don't want anyone doing those email pulls, loosely. Well, you can set up audit in place to monitor who's using eDiscovery in your organization, and more importantly, what they're doing with eDiscovery. What searches are they performing? Who are they performing it on? Things like that. And you could have alerts in place to say, I don't want any eDiscovery done on any C-level people. And if something like that is done, flag this alert, and then quickly take those actions to, discipline the person that made that, policy violation potentially. So they really complement each other well. And I did a talk on it last year showing how eDiscovery can be used practically and how, more importantly, you can audit that usage as well.
Yes, clear. That's very clear. Now, I've also seen a use case about eDiscovery, like preparing for legal action. Can you share more about that?
Preparing for legal action. Well, okay. So if, for example, you need to, for example, let me think. If an employer, right? So an employee. If an employee leaves the organization, and they want to sue their previous organization for whatever reason, you then potentially need to gather all the evidence for that employee's behavior to aid in that claim, right? Because maybe they feel that they've been unfairly dismissed because they haven't done any work or whatever it is, right? So you could then use eDiscovery to show, like, I don't know, appraisal reviews from the manager to say, no, this was a good employee. Unfortunately, the company just made a decision to lay them off. Then you have that evidence from eDiscovery that is, it's persistent, it's immutable as well, so it hasn't been modified, so you can preserve it. There's a phase of the eDiscovery lifecycle called preservation, which is very important because if someone takes the data from eDiscovery, modifies it, and then represents in court, it's not as legally sound, right? So with your legal proceeding scenario, you can directly export it from eDiscovery to like an Azure storage account, and then sort of lock it down, make it persistent, and then present it in court when needed to say, hey, even though the employee is claiming that they were unfairly dismissed, here's some evidence showing that they had really stellar performance reviews. So these claims are false, basically, and then you can save your company a lot of money because you don't have to pay for that lawsuit. So that's just one example how eDiscovery can help with legal proceedings. The other one is, for example, if there's an insider threat, before they leave your organization, all of a sudden they're, accessing emails that they shouldn't, or they're accessing files in SharePoint. eDiscovery will help you see what they were accessing, and then you can retrieve them from their mailbox, from their SharePoint, from their OneDrive, etc., to again take any disciplinary action. If they've left the organization, you may wish to get the police involved or HR involved, and if they're still in the organization, you can use that evidence to discipline them and take action. So yeah, that's two use cases why eDiscovery can help for legal. And traditionally, eDiscovery has been more about legal and compliance, but now there is a growing emergence of using eDiscovery for security and specifically incident response.
Very interesting, yes. Now, when you move to cloud, like on Azure, typically what I find is people have some misconceptions or misunderstandings, and they think like we're now on Microsoft Azure, thus we're by default safe in everything and secure because everything is secure by default, which of course is not the case. There are many things that you still have to do yourself. So, talking about Microsoft Purview and the compliance part, what are some common misconceptions that you have seen with your clients or customers when it comes to I'm using Purview and I'm using M365, thus I'm safe?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So a lot of people, like you said, would say, well, it's Microsoft's problem. Why do I need to care about it, right? But the tenant is not secure by default. So specifically, what Purview can help you with is protecting your data, right? So we're now touching into another solution of Purview, which is called information protection. So Purview information protection allows you to detect sensitive content in your environment and protect it. The way you protect it is by using something called sensitivity labels. And for any business leaders or CISOs, etc., that are listening and find this quite overwhelming, at the start, think of this as like a walk, crawl, run. Is it crawl, walk, run? Crawl, walk, run approach, right? So to crawl, initially, you're just trying to discover the data, and maybe you just want to classify the data to say, hey, this is confidential, this is public, this is internal. Those are common labels. And then as you mature, you could be like, well, now I want to apply encryption on the content so that even if it's shared across departments, the other department can't open it and make sense of it because it's only set to this department. And then as you mature further, you can take like automatic labeling. So now the users don't even need to classify the label. You can put regexes and other sort of automatic patterns in place to automatically detect the content and apply those labels, which then make a much better user experience, right? So that's definitely one. I don't know if it's a misconception a little bit, but I think it's just a lack of understanding that people don't realize that your data in Microsoft 365 can be sensitive because people are sharing it across the organization. So you could have, going back to your legal example, you could have a lot of attorney client privilege type documents, which you won't just want anyone to be able to access and share, right? You need to be able to lock those down. So Purview will really help you do that with information protection. So that's one way that Purview can help securing your Microsoft 365 tenant.
Yeah, so the customers that I serve and the clients that I see, they typically have almost no data labeling at all. Like they have a repository of 10, 15, 20 years of Office SharePoint data files. And now they feel like we need to classify and start working with this because everything is now one big gray mess, basically. What is some advice that you can give to such leaders? Like, how can we best write a policy or implement this in an organization? And then how would this help, or how would Purview help with that?
Yeah, so as I touched on, right, so Purview within information protection has this feature called Data Explorer, or previously known as Content Explorer. And what that allows you to do is to see at a glance what data in your tenant contains things like, Australian passport numbers, UK national insurance numbers, any sort of health specifics. So depending on your organization, right, if you're a insurance firm, you want to make sure that, for example, insurance numbers are locked down because that's sensitive to your business. So, Data Explorer, Content Explorer will help you identify those. And then you could, again, it's like a crawl, walk, run approach. Like I said, you can't tackle everything at once. You really need to understand what data you care about, prioritize that. So as an insurance firm, you'd care about insurance numbers, for example, right? So detect those, protect those with labels. And like I said, if it's quite intimidating to start with, at least start classifying them to say, hey, this is confidential to the business. Train your users on how to classify the documents as well. You can even do something like recommended labeling. So what I touched on earlier is automatic labeling labeling where, it will automatically apply the label, for lack of a better word. But there's like a step in between, which is called recommended labeling. So the way recommended labeling will work is if anyone in your organization, and I'm using the insurance firm as this example, tries to make a document with an insurance number or a passport number, it will say, hey, it looks like this document has a sensitive data, Australian passport number, whatever. You may wish to classify it using this label. So that then like encourages that behavior and almost becomes second nature to the user, where next time if they do it, they may intentionally just classify the document because they're used to that recommendation. And if they don't, at least I'll have that recommendation there to take the action. And then as you mature, you can then automate it, right? So again, going back to your example, right? Start with what data matters start with what data matters to you, identify that, apply the label for classification, then move to like recommended labeling and then eventually automatic labeling. And then obviously you can take things like DLP, right, to make sure that any classified documents do not leave your organization, because that's your intellectual property. You don't want to have any fines with, like you mentioned, NIST, GDPR is another one. You don't want to have any fines where your data has left your organization. So having that strategy in mind of identifying, detecting, classifying, and ultimately protecting and preventing the data from leaving the organization, you can handle things much better. But yeah, it can be quite overwhelming to start with. So Microsoft's approach, and they have a deployment guide, they say start with a few sensitivity labels like public, internal, confidential. That's at least 3 simple things that your users can get used to. They're self-explanatory. Like if it's public, then it's fair game, it's available to everyone. If it's internal, then it's partly sensitive because it should be specific to your organization and shouldn't be shared externally. And if it's confidential, then it may not even wish to be shared widely in your organization. Only maybe certain departments should see it and have access to it, right? So that kind of 3 label approach could work well for companies or CISOs that are starting on this journey. But it is a journey, and you're not going to get perfect by day 1. So stick with it. Go through the Microsoft documentation, reach out to Microsoft support if needed, leverage content from, myself and other Microsoft MVPs, etc. in the community, and try and adopt some of those practices and philosophies. And yeah, just keep moving forward to ultimately secure your organization.
Hi there, I'm Jetro Wils, your host, and I love bringing you fresh insights on cybersecurity, cloud technology, governance, and auditing. Cyber threats are evolving fast. Protecting your business, ensuring compliance, and maintaining trust with your stakeholders isn't just important, it is essential. Ignoring cybersecurity, that's a risk you don't want to take. No matter your industry or company size, protecting sensitive data and ensuring operational resilience should be a priority. Regulations like NIS2 and DORA are already shaping the way businesses handle security, making compliance non-negotiable. At SecWise, we help businesses like yours stay secure and compliant. Here's what we offer: security roadmaps, practical steps tailored to your operations, Azure, M365, or even your hybrid workplace. Compliance readiness: meet ISO 27001, NIS2 and DORA requirements with confidence. SOC implementation: real-time threat detection and response 24/7. Cloud and AI security: advanced protection against evolving threats. And end-to-end support, from risk analysis to remediation and continuous access to our specialists. Since you're listening to the Blue Dragon podcast, as a thank you, you will get 3% off your next purchase within the SecWise portfolio. Whether it's a full NIS2 assessment or managed security services, 3% off your next purchase can save you hundreds of euros. Visit secwise.eu/Blue Dragon podcast to get started. Make cybersecurity your strength. Get started today. Visit secwise.eu/Blue Dragon podcast. Yeah, because what you typically see is then by default the value of the label becomes like confidential, and then like everything is locked. You can't do much about it. So then people automatically move it to a higher or less strict labeling. So it's a mindset change. It's change management. People need to understand that they need to classify their documents. And now what you're seeing, and perhaps you can share a bit more about that, is like even in Teams, when you're doing Teams calls, now there's the option to even classify the meeting, because the recording also has impact. So how do you see that evolving?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Teams by default are linked to a Microsoft 365 group, right? So you want to protect the data in that Microsoft 365 group, because a Microsoft 365 group, for anyone unfamiliar, gives you access to a lot of resources under the hood, right? It gives you access to a team site, where you can have, like you mentioned, Teams meetings and calls and things. But also it gives you access to a SharePoint site and an Outlook group shared mailbox, right? So there could be sensitive data in all those different places. Applying a label to the team site will help you to protect all that data. If you're just having an ad hoc Teams call between colleagues and things, that's like a regular cadence. Maybe you have like a one-to-one or you have a catch-up between departments. Again, classifying that data helps because you don't know if someone in your team, maybe has a colleague that's looking to come into your team and you're like, oh, hey, we're working on this. So when you join, this is something you can get up to speed with. But because that colleague isn't technically part of your department, sharing that data outside of your department could be seen as a violation. And applying that sensitive label to the meeting prevents that data from leaving, even if the content is shared, because that other colleague won't have access to the label and therefore won't be able to decrypt that content. One other thing I want to come back to, what you touched on just before you went into Teams, was downgrading the label. Using things like Purview Audit and Activity Explorer, you can understand when the downgrade is made from, for example, confidential to public. But more importantly, users, if you configure it, have to supply a justification to downgrade, and Purview Audit and Activity Explorer will show you that justification. So if someone just puts like a random justification, like, I wanted to do this, or something weird, right? You can kind of, quote unquote, discipline them or train them to say, hey, it's better if you supply an actual justification because, we actually use this. And, if you don't give a good enough justification, maybe we're going to prevent you from downgrading the label in future. So you kind of need to work with us to say, why did you downgrade it, and provide exact details. So that's just something I wanted to cover. But yeah, in terms of Teams, ultimately securing the data in terms of the Teams meeting helps it from being overshared even in your organization. And then ultimately you can also, take things at the tenant level to prevent it being shared outside your organization. But I think one thing that's critical is department to department sharing. If something is meant for Department A, Department B people should not see it, regardless of if they're going to come into Department A later. And applying something like a sensitivity label with encryption would prevent Department B in that case from seeing that content because they won't be able to decrypt it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a great lesson for business and IT leaders in general. Like, we want to protect the data and the information anywhere inside the organization. And that now even means in an age of hybrid working and remote working, that the conversations, the meetings that are getting recorded, that are getting transcribed automatically, that are then being used by a co-pilot or another AI system to generate the minutes of the meeting. All of this is also part of your information that needs to be secured. And so, great, thank you for enabling that insight. Wonderful. Now let's move to the next part. Is more about Defender, XDR, and operational maturity. So you have a lot of experience in the field of Defender for Endpoint and Sentinel and XDR and basically the whole Microsoft stack on that side. So from your perspective, if you're a mid-sized European organization, like, where should you start when it comes to Microsoft security?
Yeah, that's also a really good question because there's different parts of the Microsoft security stack, right? So if you don't have any sort of endpoint monitoring in place, Defender for Endpoint is probably going to be the most value add initially because that will help you to monitor activities that are taking place on your endpoints. If someone downloads a malicious file, Defender for Endpoint could block on it, could alert on it. You can also do some threat hunting to understand what's happened on the device. You can take containment actions. So if, for example, you as an organization are most worried about device level threats, for example, ransomware, then deploying Defender for Endpoint is a no-brainer, right? But additionally, you should also care about emails, right? Like we touched on before, there's one thing about emails shared between your organization or shared from your organization to the outside, but what about internal receiving emails from threat actors or from anyone trying to phish your company, for example? So for that, you should definitely have some Defender for Office policies in place, and Microsoft does a good job of giving you preset security policies. So there's two levels of that, which is standard and strict. Again, self-explanatory, but strict really enforces really strict protection, so it applies like the maximum protection. But if you're just an organization getting started, even the standard level will help you. And why it's beneficial to do it that way is because configuring the policies from scratch is quite complicated, right? There's many options, there's many sub options. There's like, if you choose this option, then other options become grayed out. So you really need to understand the dependencies. But if you just apply the standard level of protection or even the strict level of protection, all those kind of config options are automatically made for you. So you don't need to worry, right? So going back to your scenario before about, oh, I've moved to Microsoft, why don't they take care of it? Well, in this case with Defender for Office, they could take care of it. Now, it's important to caveat that it won't be 100% safe, right? As you mature, the idea is that you would get other people in to help. That could be consultancies, that could be Microsoft, etc., to understand that configuration. And then as you get better and better, you can move away from those preset policies to custom policies. But to start with, if it's quite intimidating and overwhelming and quite new for you, definitely go with the preset policies. So that's two things I would recommend, right? Do Defender for Endpoint because that will give you the EDR protection, which for endpoints is critical because your users are doing all sorts of things on their endpoints, right? They're browsing websites, they could be downloading files, those are the main two. And then with the Defender for Office, it would help you to protect against like phishing, spam, things like that could be malicious, impacting your users from the outside. But yeah, there's a lot more to the stack. There's Defender for Cloud Apps, there's Defender for Identity. There's also Sentinel, like you mentioned, but starting with Defender for Endpoint and Defender for Office, I think is a really good way to just get yourself familiar with the Microsoft stack and start protecting your company in terms of your endpoints and your emails and data in Office 365 as well.
Yes, so you say start with the endpoints because that's where your users are. That's also where a lot of the data lives that they're using and consuming, basically. So, okay, that makes sense. But then the follow-up question would be, if you take two photos of an organization, both, I mean, the same mid-sized European organization, one before and one after, like what would the after picture look like of a mature organization regarding to endpoint detection and XDR?
Okay, so with a mature organization, once you've deployed Microsoft Defender for Endpoint for quite a while, you should have really specific groups, right? So, for example, if you're a business that does work in multiple countries, so let's say you do France, you do Hungary, you do Canada, right? So you would have specific devices scoped to those groups. So you can create a group in Defender for Endpoint where these are the only machines that are in Canada, these are the only machines in France, things like that. Then you can have specific security personnel that manage only those devices. And why that helps is because you may have some regulations in place where you're not supposed to see the data in France if you're in Canada, right? So applying that really, granular level of controls and permissions could also show maturity. More importantly, with those groups, you can then set things like auto remediation. So if an alert or a detection is detected, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint can take those actions about containing, purging the malicious file, blocking the URLs, the IP addresses, all of that it can do depending on the configuration you apply. So a mature organization would almost go for semi-automated remediation, if not full automated remediation. Whereas at the start, you may want to go a bit manual because you're not sure exactly how the automation is going to work. You probably think it's a bit risky depending on your risk appetite. But as you mature and get better, you should be having those checks and balances in place where you can have automation kicks off and maybe you have one manual person kind of review that automation and then it's just a quick click. And if you want to automate it further, you could have a logic app potentially, right? Where it could say Microsoft Defender Endpoint wants to do this. It sends an email to your SOC team or puts a message in your Teams chat. And then you just click a button in the Teams adaptive card or you click a button in your email to say, yes, I allow this action or no, I don't allow this action. Because again, as we said, if Microsoft takes care of that automation, it can also make some mistakes. What happens if it isolates a domain controller? That could be disastrous to your business. If there's ransomware on your domain controller, yes, you want to isolate it. But if it's just a low-level malware, you may not want to isolate it. You may want to take other what do they call it? Compensating controls on the domain controller to minimize that blast radius. So to summarize, right, a mature organization would have department level groups for their endpoints. They would have specific personnel that could only see the devices in those departments or countries. And then they should have a level of automation with workflows that basically have some human input, whether to take those actions or not take those actions. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry for that. Yeah, that's great because that neatly goes into the next question. Like there is this balance between automation and human in the loop and making a human judgment. So how do you see that balance for a mid-sized organization? And is there like a danger that you're seeing if we're automating too much or relying too much on automation?
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to your risk appetite when you get started. So some companies initially would just be like, I don't want any automation because I'm worried about what it's going to do. So while that's quite manual, quite painful, etc., in the beginning, it really encourages a culture of learning because if you analysts need to manually deal with things, they'll need to investigate themselves. They'll get better as the more they do that. And then eventually they may either build their own automations or they'll have their checks and balances in place to automate what they've done manually. So they could still have Microsoft doing stuff manually, but what they've done on a day-to-day basis manually themselves, they could automate those actions. So you're not using Microsoft automation, you're using your own automation based on what you've done. The converse to that is organizations that just don't have time to learn and deal with this. They would probably go with semi-automated remediation or even full automatic remediation. Now, with those, there is quite a bit of a risk because it could take those actions without any sort of workflows in place. And while you can undo things like isolation or antivirus scans or purging files, etc., it could be quite disastrous to your business. If, for example, a cmd.exe, right, people use command prompt, for example, if the hash of that process was to be blocked in Defender for Endpoint, that means that no one could run command prompt in your organization. So that would prevent developers, that would prevent your IT admins, that would prevent anyone else that uses command prompt for any sort of workflows from doing business. So if, for example, Defender was to take that action overnight, you won't realize till the morning. But what happens about your developers that work overnight that need to do scripts, right? You're disrupting business productivity. So it's a bit of a risk. And I think if companies go full in, they need to almost accept that risk to say, well, now we're trusting Microsoft fully. And if we're not mature enough to put our own workflows in place, then ultimately it could be quite disastrous and chaotic. As you mature, though, you could try and put those workflows in place to say, yes, I trust Microsoft. Microsoft could take the action, but I need to ultimately approve it before it actually takes place in the center, in the console, sorry, right? And there's something called Action Center where any sort of action like isolation, etc., could go through that workflow for approval. But like I said, organizations that are, respectfully speaking, quite immature and they want to offload everything to Microsoft, they run the risk of disasters like command prompt being blocked if Microsoft deems it malicious, right? So it really comes down to a balance of your risk appetite, knowing the sort of strengths and weaknesses, accepting those while they are, but also being mindful to say, well, now we're maturing, we have more budget, let's employ some people that really know this, which could be consultancies, it could be external employees, or it could be Microsoft themselves, to really start putting those checks and balances in place to reduce the level of automation or to basically guardrails around the automation to say automation can take place, but I need to ultimately have the final say, right? And you touched on things like AI. AI can hallucinate all the time, right? So similarly, how we don't take AI at face value, you need to double check that information. You should also be able to double check or make sure that the actions your automation is taking are reasonable and valid for the scenarios that's occurring. So I always say that you should have a human. I don't think automation is at that stage where you can fully rely on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I like your principle of start with manual first because then your team builds up confidence and insight and understanding. And if you then document the decisions that you make as a team, then you can automate them, but you're still on top of your game. While in the other scenario, it's you go for the default automations, you kind of lose control, you lose the sense of competency, like do I know what's going on? And it creates actually a fear and uncertainty in your team that they don't touch it, just leave it running, right? Because we don't know what it does. So I like that principle of go manual first. It's tough in the beginning, but you'll learn the most.
And one other thing, if I can come back to your point about relying on that automation, right? Companies could think like, oh, so set it once and forget it, but it needs a continual review, because what if you add other devices that you're not aware of, or what if you have other business processes that you need to, whitelist, for example, in Defender for Endpoint? It's a continual game, right? And again, that's not to scare people, but you could just take it month by month. You could take it every 6 months. You could take it every 3 months. But just know that securing your organization is definitely not a set it once and forget it. You need to do continual reviews. You need to check if your use cases and detections, etc., are still fit for purpose. How can we optimize them? If there's any that are not adding value, how can we reduce them? How can we remove them? How can we move them to an audit state? Things like this you need to think about to continually improve your posture. It's definitely not a set it once and forget it. You need to make those continual actions and thought processes, like you mentioned, about
Mm-hmm.
documentation and decision trees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense. So let's move to the topic of real world scenarios and lessons learned. You have lots of experiences and as an incident responder. Like without naming names, like what's a real world incident that taught you something new about how teams handles incidents? Like teams handle security incidents. You think you're prepared until it happens. Like what did you learn from one of those incidents?
Okay, I can talk about a previous incident. So we had one that it was a Defender for Endpoint detection, and it showed a suspicious PowerShell occurring on an endpoint. Okay, so the PowerShell in question had some encoded string in base64. So we were able to decode that because there's lots of online tools with base64 and things like that, right, to make sense of it. So once we did that, we realized that basically it was planting a registry key for persistence. So we reached out to our threat intel team at the time to kind of understand like what is this behavior, because they would map, for example, these tools, tactics, and procedures (TTPs), right, to certain threat groups. So we gave it to them, and they were able to attribute this to Bootloader, which is a banking Trojan, right? But just to be clear, this happened in a previous organization. Um, so what we did then is we were like, okay, so it looks like this company is, quote unquote, infected with bootloader. Now, what we wanted to understand is, how did this even happen? So the way that suspicious PowerShell and registry key was created, we later found was through a scheduled task. So, okay, we were like, okay, well, how long has this been happening? So we needed to understand when that scheduled task was created. Now, what I didn't say initially is that this was during an onboarding of Defender for Endpoint, right? Typically, companies would do like a migration from their current service. It could be CrowdStrike, it could be Carbon Black, it could be any other EDR. Um, so they were migrating from CrowdStrike. So we had only recently migrated them to Defender for Endpoint. So we didn't have the logs and telemetry going back far enough to show when that scheduled task was created. So we had to rely on the client to give us that data from CrowdStrike. So it was kind of like a joint effort between Defender and CrowdStrike to really put it together. Um, but what it showed us was that CrowdStrike clearly missed it, because it wasn't until the device was onboarded to Defender, that we had this detection. Because had it been detected before, well, it should have been dealt with, right? Why is it still occurring if the device is now in Defender for Endpoint? So we fed that back to the client, and they were able to feed it back to CrowdStrike, and it turned out that it was missing in CrowdStrike's detection logic. But one other thing is, while we were investigating this, once we realized that it was bootloader and things like that, right, we were able to make the decision to say, hey, we need to, isolate this device. We need to run an antivirus scan. But as an MSSP, we didn't have permissions to do that. We needed the client to do it. So we had to reach out to them on email on priority to make it happen. Um, and so, the client was still quite immature in their understanding, right? Going back to what we said earlier, if you're not doing it manual, you don't understand how things work, where to click in the portal, how to understand, etc. So we had to prepare some guidance for them on how to do the antivirus scan and isolate it, right? All of this is kind of wasting time in a loose way, or making the infection go more, things like that. But that was the situation, so we dealt with it. So they isolated the device. So we were like, okay, cool. This has been contained. They were able to run the AV scan, which then would identify any further malicious artifacts on the device, etc. And then we didn't see any other alerts for the rest of the day. So we're like, okay, cool. This seems okay. They've contained the device, things like that. The next day we come in, and a few hours later we see the same alert. And we're like, hey, what's going on here? We already isolated this device. So what happened is that the client didn't take that machine away from the user, they just isolated it. So that user then logged in the next morning using something called cache credentials, which then triggered the same scheduled task to occur, which then triggered the same PowerShell to occur, and triggered the same registry key to be planted. So it was basically a repeat cycle. So we reached out to the client and said, hey, you need to basically swap this machine out for the user or rebuild the machine or whatever you need to do to basically prevent this machine from happening prevent this machine from being in the possession of the user, right? Because otherwise this is just going to keep happening. And this was during COVID times, right? So it was quite difficult to get the user in office and things like that. So they basically had to tell the user to shut down the machine, and then they quickly dispatched another machine to them, and then the user returned that machine, and then it was collected in terms of forensic artifacts, and then ultimately rebuilt and put into the cycle. But that taught us two things as an MSSP, right? One, we should have a level of trust and authority to be able to isolate or perform antivirus on machines, because had we done that quickly, if there were additional threats, then those could have been prevented. In the time that we had to prepare that guidance for the client to do the isolation and the antivirus, the infection could have spread. It could have gotten worse. It could have led to other detections, right? So after that, we were able to get a level of authority and trust to do that for certain devices. We obviously wouldn't be able to do it on really sensitive devices, but we could do it on sort of, level one devices, which are like user laptops, for example, things like that, right? We wouldn't be able to do it on domain controllers or more sensitive ones because that makes sense. There could be business impacts there, right? Application servers could be performing functions for those applications that we wouldn't be aware of, and the business needs to make those decisions in terms of what is the impact. But at least we could do it on user endpoints because there's low impact there. So that was a good win. The second thing that we told the client is like, hey, it seems like I mentioned, CrowdStrike missed this, Defender picked it up, which actually helped us as an organization because we were basically helping organizations unlock the potential within their E5 license. And ultimately, we won the work ultimately to, if you think about it that way, to migrate the client to Defender for Endpoint. And that was a successful migration. And, we were able to prove the value there. But yeah, that was an interesting incident. It definitely taught me a lot. I never knew about bootloader, right? I never knew about the registry keys being planted. So I did a bit of research. There's a lot of reports online about bootloader and how to detect it, how to investigate it. But like I said, it was a good partnership between CrowdStrike and Defender because ultimately we needed the previous CrowdStrike logs to gather that scheduled task when it was created and make it better in the future. But ultimately, it was a win for us because Defender for Endpoint detected something that CrowdStrike missed. And just to that point, right, that's a reason why some companies have two EDRs in place, because you could have Defender for Endpoint in passive mode, and you could have something called EDR in block mode, where if your first antivirus misses something, Defender can step in and say, hey, this is malicious, I'm going to block it. But you need to configure that, and as you mature, you can get understanding how that works. But yeah, just to say, Defender for Endpoint can complement your existing solution, or it can replace it entirely, depending on what you want.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, that's a very interesting case study you had there, indeed, about as an MSSP or a SOC having the capabilities and the trust and authorities to take in some or perform some measures that could potentially hinder the business, but at least you contained it as fast as you could. Very nice. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Now let's move to the last part is about European trends and seeing how Europe is now dealing with new types of legislation. Think of NIS2. We of course already had GDPR for privacy and data protection. DORA is also there for the financial industry, which I'm sure you'll hear about and actually be acquainted with. So, from your perspective, seeing all of this landscape and regulations, how should IT leaders think about aligning with Microsoft tooling and these regulation frameworks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the emerging threat that we're definitely seeing is insider threats, right? A lot of companies are laying off people for whatever reason, right? Company downsize, lack of profits, whatever it is. But there's people that are being let go that could do damage in your organization. And ultimately, if they were to exfiltrate that data, like I mentioned earlier, you could have fines. You're in violation of those regulations, right? Or if they were to exfiltrate that data onto their personal device, and then for some reason they went on a dodgy website on the personal device, and a threat actor was able to compromise them, or any sort of remote access trojans or things like that, where then the threat actor gets that data, they could hold your company to ransom or similar to say, hey, we have this data, we're going to leak it unless you pay us. Now, where Purview can help with insider threat is threefold, right? One is the protection of the data that I touched on earlier. So sensitivity labels, classify, protect, encrypt, things like that, right? The second stage to that is DLP, because if that insider threat tries to share that data to their personal email before they leave, DLP policies in place with those sensitivity labels would prevent that data from leaving the organization. Now, that is a far better and far more mature approach than letting it leave the organization and then, disciplining or dealing with the employee afterwards. You can try and get your attestations to say, employee, from a legal standpoint, we need you to confirm you've deleted this email. Employee replies saying, yes, I've deleted the email. How do you know? How do you know they haven't taken a picture of it? How do you know they haven't downloaded it? How do you know they haven't screenshotted it? Right? There's different ways and means of and mechanisms of persisting that data if the employee really wants to keep it. So the best approach is to prevent it from even leaving your organization. That's step two. Step three is the Purview solution called Insider Risk Management. Now this one is really powerful because if you know you're going to lay off someone, and typically companies would have a different round of layoffs, they may know who's going to be laid off and things like that. Obviously, that's very sensitive data, but you could put your insider risk management policies in place to monitor those specific leaver behaviors before their leave date. Now, what could more practically happen is you could have a system to manage your employees, right? That could be something like Dayforce or Workday or any sort of systems where you would have like, this is the last day of the employee. You can integrate Purview Insider Risk Management with those systems to say, hey, start monitoring the activity of these users 90 days, 45 days, 30 days, etc. before this leave date. And what it will do is it will start giving you signals. So those signals could be, hey, user is trying to upload to cloud storage like Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, etc. It could be users sending emails externally. It could be users sharing files outside the organization. All those signals will help you then enforce alerts, which you can then take action on, right? If you can quickly catch that behavior before they leave the organization, you can ultimately reduce the damage that they could do to your organization. As you mature, you can also put preventions in place. So as it detects those behaviors, it can also then escalate immediately to eDiscovery cases. It can immediately start isolating that account, disabling that account. It can start locking them out of their computer. If you have Intune, you can remotely, lock their machine, things like that to ultimately reduce that damage, right? So doing a mixture of information protection, which helps you classify and protect your data, then moving on to DLP to prevent the data from leaving the organization, then moving on to insider risk management to gather those signals. Really, all three of those can help you to reduce your insider threat exposure. And I really encourage CISOs and business leaders to focus on insider threats because now companies are quote unquote sophisticated enough to deal with malware, to deal with like external threat phishing, things like that, but what they're really missing is insider threats. And insider threats have access to your environment by default because they need to do work in SharePoint, Microsoft 365, etc. They could also have permissions in your tenant. They could be global admins, they could be security admins, they could be global readers, they could be purview admins. They have a lot of privileges in the tenant if you're not careful. So you need to start monitoring their activity, again going back to purview audit, which is what powers the signals with insider risk management. Start monitoring those signals, start taking action quickly, and then ultimately you can prevent and mitigate those insider threats. So yeah, a combination of those three is what I would encourage companies to focus on to align to those regulations and ultimately reduce your fines that you have to pay, because no one wants to pay a GDPR fine for something that could have been prevented, right?
Mm-hmm. So, last question. When you take a look at the European landscape from a security perspective, are you seeing there are two possibilities? Either companies go for one ecosystem and try to, go with one and have the the compounding effect of the whole ecosystem. So we're all going in Microsoft, for example, or there is more the philosophy of best of breed and putting them together. What is your observation on how organizations are dealing with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So taking back to my MSSP days, our job was to basically help companies unlock the potential in their E5. So they would have an E5 license. So an E5 license, for those unfamiliar, give you access to the whole Microsoft 365 stack, a variety of security solutions, and compliance solutions as well, right? So they would have that E5 license, but they would still have vendors like CrowdStrike or SIEMs like Splunk because maybe they've got legacy contracts in place. Maybe the security teams have been trained on those tools. We would help them realize that, hey, you already are paying for this and you're not using it. And we're not suggesting you to replace it, but what we are suggesting is get the native protections in place for at least Microsoft 365. Because getting your Microsoft 365 logs into Sentinel versus Splunk could allow you to do certain enrichments that maybe Splunk can't do, right? Start seeing the value of where those tools could help for Microsoft 365. And then ultimately, if you want to move like your firewall data and other third-party sources to Sentinel because maybe Splunk is inefficient, maybe you realize that Sentinel can do a better job of filtering that data, enriching that data, putting automation workflows in place, then slowly you can start migrating. But what I would say to your question, right, is there is definitely a mixture of kind of best of breed currently. And, I'm not saying that companies need to go all into Microsoft security. Find out what's best for your organization. Sometimes it could be good to have a mixture of Defender for Endpoint and Splunk, but just understand that there will be certain limitations because the Defender for Endpoint logs that go to Splunk may need additional parsing, may need additional deciphering, may need additional enrichment, whereas Defender for Endpoint to Sentinel would do that natively because Microsoft wants you to get the best benefit. And ultimately, you touched on the Microsoft security stack. What I would say is if a company has the full Microsoft security stack, you're getting an unparalleled telemetry, which can really help you for incident response. You're seeing things end to end from the life cycle in an easy to understand way. And if you have things like Security Copilot in the future or even currently, that will allow you to basically ask those questions in a human readable way, take those actions necessarily, and basically prevent those threats, right? So I would say it's a mixture. But just start with where you are at the moment. I would encourage any companies using the non-Microsoft stack to engage MSSPs, consultancies, or engage Microsoft themselves and see how those solutions could complement your solution. And then do like a review, right? Do a gap analysis, do a proof of concept, and ultimately decide where you want to go. If you want to keep both and pay for both, then feel free. But ultimately, you may find it cheaper to just go all in with E5, and then you don't have to have those other vendors in place. Finally, what I would say is there could be a risk to going all in with Microsoft, right? Microsoft had obviously has had breaches in the past, right? Some of us may know the Midnight Blizzard from last year. Things like that could have caused confidence to be lost. What I would say to that is, well, I mean, a company, there's no company probably that doesn't use Microsoft 365. Like, there are competitors like Google Workspace and so on, but they're not as widespread. They're not as understood by most companies and organizations. So you're going to have a level of Microsoft. You can't completely avoid it. But what you could do is if, for example, you're fully in-house and then you start losing confidence in Microsoft, you could try those third party again, right? And do a gap analysis and see where the value is. But I still believe that if you've gone full into Microsoft, you're not going to get the level of telemetry in an easy to understand way as you would if you're using a mixture of third party and Microsoft solutions.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you for sharing that insight. Purav, to wrap up this episode, what is your future looking like professionally speaking? Are you thinking of writing a book? Are you thinking of doing a new type of training and sharing it with people? What's your future looking like?
Yeah, I would really like to kick off the Deciphering UAL series again because I went all into it in 2023 and then I kind of abandoned it to do more talks about Purview eDiscovery and Defender XDR. So I really want to pick up Deciphering UAL again because that was my niche and that's ultimately what led me, I think, to become an MVP. Outside of that, I want to do a few more talks around Microsoft 365 workloads that I haven't covered before. For example, Copilot is highlighting at organizations the oversharing in SharePoint. That could be a really good one to dive into. I also want to touch on Entra ID because Entra ID protection, for example, can help you dealing with any sort of risky behavior with your users, your sign-ins, things like that. I also want to touch on Azure because it's been a while since I've covered any sort of Azure security. I did a webinar on Azure Site Recovery, I think 2021. So obviously things have changed quite a bit from then. In terms of book, yeah, I mean, I did a technical review for a book on the SC100 certification by Orange AVA last year. I also was a technical reviewer of the eDiscovery book with the co-author Ryan. I was co-authoring it, but the book changed quite a bit significantly, so I'm back to technical reviewer now. So I'll continue pursuing that. But maybe in the future, I could become an author specifically around Microsoft Forensics, focusing on things like the UAL and deciphering it. I'm not sure. But for now, I'm really keen to contribute the content back to the community when I can through a mixture of posts, talks, and yeah, contributing to book reviews. And then career professionally wise, since you asked, incident response is really great. It is very reactive, like I mentioned. And I think going back to my consulting MSSP days, I really enjoyed strategically advising companies. So I potentially ultimately see myself as a Microsoft cybersecurity architect. And I really think architecture is where I could suit because having the incident response experience, I can guide companies on how to take proactive measures in terms of their tenant configuration to minimize incidents. But also I can help them dealing with their incidents currently to say, hey, these are some capabilities or automation you may want to put in place. So I think, yeah, that's ultimately where I want to go with my career and content aspirations.
Great. And for those listeners and viewers who don't know the term UAL, what does it stand for?
Yeah, so the UAL is Unified Audit Log, and that's basically the log of all your activities in your Microsoft 365 tenant. When I touched earlier Purview Audit basically helps you retrieve those logs, and those logs are called the Unified Audit Log.
Great. If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to connect?
Yeah, the best way is LinkedIn. I'm sure we can put my link to LinkedIn or a QR code or something in the description. So you can search me, Purav Desai, and you can also follow my GitHub because I have a variety of content on my GitHub. But yeah, I'm most active on LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with me and reach out. I don't really use Twitter or Instagram for cyber content. Maybe in the future I'll set one up. But for now, LinkedIn is the best place to reach me.
Great. Purav, thank you so much for joining this episode of the Blue Dragon podcast. I wish you all the best and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Jetro. Hope your audience finds some value in what I've shared. Really appreciate the opportunity. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining this episode of the Blue Dragon podcast. I hope you had lots of value out of our conversation, everything about Purview, compliance, and all about the regulation space in Europe. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, even give a comment. And if you have not done so already, please visit bluedragonpodcast.com and subscribe for the email where you're getting a nice summary of this entire episode. With that said, I wish you a wonderful day and see you next time.